the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus. Good morning. Sorry my voice is not functioning as I wish, so I won't be able to chant or sing quite as much, and I know that's going to be a great disappointment to some, and to others it might be a nice respite from all the singing, all the chanting. In any case, today we have some really wonderful readings that are tied together and reveal to us, well, the two great commandments. Luke is the only gospel writer who gives us this particular account and the parable of the Good Samaritan. We know this parable. And even if you don't know the parable, perhaps, you at least know the title, Good Samaritan. I mean, people who are not even Christian know that term, and it comes from today's gospel from Luke. This is the origin of where that phrase or term comes from. To be a Good Samaritan is from the parable that Jesus gives in today's gospel. The first thing we should really take note of is the posture of the one who's coming to Jesus. Okay, this is a scholar of the law, someone who in today's terms might be called an attorney. He comes to Jesus to test him. He already has in his own mind the answer. And so that's the posture that this scholar of the law is coming to Jesus. And we know this because it's made clear. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Or rather, we know that he's testing him because St. Luke tells us preceding that sentence. What must I do to inherit eternal life? He asks. And in typical Jesus fashion, he does not respond with a very declarative statement. He asks a question in response to the question. What must I do? Well, what's written in the law? How do you read it? Kind of like when mom or dad is asked a question from their child, well, do I really have to do my homework? Well, what do you think? Yes. And so he comes with a question that's already in his own mind, he knows the answer. Jesus responds with another question. Well, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And even the word how is a bit curious, but in order to kind of appreciate that second question that Jesus gives to him, we have to realize that the Jewish scriptures, written in Hebrew, were written in such a way that they didn't have vowels in the written text. It was a string of consonants without punctuation, with very little, if any, spacing, mostly because they didn't have paper to write on. And so they had to use very carefully all the space that was available to them. And so there really was many and varied ways of interpreting a particular text. So when he asks them, how do you read it? Well, the same text could be interpreted based on how or which vowels were placed within that text. You would have a different interpretation, a different reading from the same letters that are there. And so Jesus is asking him a legitimate and kind of literal question. How do you read it? And he says in reply, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Pause. There's a comma there. That's the starting point. That's where we must begin. The secondary command, and your neighbor as yourself, is integral to living or finding eternal life, but it is subordinated to the first command. These are given in a list that are prioritized. The more important and the starting point is that we love God over and above all things first. Sometimes we get these orders confused. I love my family. I love my brother, my sister, my parents. But if I love them over and above God, I am lost. When we love anyone or anything over and above God, we are confused. The reason being that God alone is the one who reveals to us what love is in itself. And so when he commands us, you shall love the Lord your God. This is coming from Deuteronomy, by the way. Not exactly the reading that we had in the first reading, but from the same book. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 6, is where this scholar of the law is getting this first command, which is known in Hebrew under the term Shema, the Hebrew word which means hear, because that was what Moses was speaking to the Israelite people in the desert. Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel. That's where that command comes from. And then similarly, from the Pentateuch, and your neighbor as yourself, is coming from the commands given in Leviticus. So these aren't novel things that come onto the scene with Jesus. These were ancient commands that the Jewish people were very familiar with. But to love God, love, which we use so often, a wonderful word, but sometimes gets confused for us as Christians because of how we apply it and to what situations we use it. But to make things clear, the perfect symbol, the perfect image of love is Christ on the cross. That is how God has chosen to reveal his infinite love for us. And if that's not the starting point, then we will be lost. Going back to this term love, we use it in all sorts of ways. I would hear on occasion my dad talking to my mom and say, "I love you, honey." Or he would say to us, the kids, or to me in particular, "I love you, mijito," which in Spanish or in English translates something like, "I love you, my little son." Right? And so that is kind of maybe the most familiar expression of that word love, or usage of it. But we use it in all sorts of different ways as well that are not exactly the kind of love that is commanded in the readings. Because we say things like, "Well, I love football," or "I love baseball," and "I love to watch the Astros come back in extra innings beating the Texas Rangers," right? We say things like that all the time. We use that word in so many different ways that sometimes we can lose sight of what true love is. True love will always demand something of me. True love will always be willing and ready to sacrifice himself or herself for the sake of the beloved. And so when this scholar of the law rightly responds, "You shall love the Lord your God," that love means that I sacrifice everything else, including myself, in order to put God first. Now, I'm highlighting this first part of the command because I think today, many times, we confuse the orders. But I don't want to make the mistake that the second part is not important. It is. Jesus goes to painstaking lengths to give this parable. So he gives this command, or this response, the lawyer, he replied to him, Jesus is replying to him, says, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Love in the way that you have expressed, have you rightly responded, God and your neighbor, do that and you will live. Now, another test, another inquiry. But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" He wants to really restrict the definition of who neighbor is. And instead of responding with "this person is or isn't neighbor," or "this person, this thing is or isn't something that we should love," he gives another parable, a lengthy kind of exposition to kind of get him to think differently. A man fell victim to robbers. He went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him, went off, leaving him half dead. The priest going down that road happened to be going down that road, saw him but passed by the other side. The Levite similarly, but a Samaritan traveler. The Samaritan was somebody who was not really a friend to the Jews. They had similar Jewish roots, but they intermarried with the Assyrians when the Assyrians came in and kind of conquered and dispersed the Jewish people. And so those Samaritans were always in conflict with the Jews. And so it was a surprise, for sure, for this scholar of the law to hear that the Samaritan is the hero in the story. Because the scholar of the law is a Jew. He's familiar with everything and hearing, well, the Samaritan is the one that did the good deed, that did the right thing. That would have been something that completely took him by surprise. There's no way he was expecting that. But the Samaritan traveler came upon him, moved with compassion, approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, bandaged them, and goes on to care for him in doing whatever he needs. In the parable, the Good Samaritan is Jesus. He is the one who comes to us and binds the wounds that are inflicted on us many times by ourselves in sinning. He's the one who binds up and pours the ointment over us, the consequences of sin that we take upon ourselves when we choose ourselves over and above God. And he is always about healing, saving, redeeming, bringing back to life. Today we try to do that in many ways. But as I've been mentioning, without loving God over and above all things first, we can't truly love neighbor as we ought. And if I can highlight one thing that I think really puts on full display the misordering of these two commands, both at the beginning of life and at the end of life. At the beginning of life, under the terms that we might use, abortion or a woman's choice, sometimes in discovering that maybe a child in utero might have some sort of physical or mental or some kind of defect, well, what kind of life would that be? It's seen by some perhaps to be an act of mercy. We don't want them to suffer knowing that they will have some sort of defect. Unless we love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, we can't value the gift of life as it should be, no matter the defect. And at the end of life, in states within our country, countries around the world are passing new laws that would help, quote unquote, help, or offer merciful ways for someone to die quickly so they don't suffer. If we don't love the Lord our God with all our heart, being, strength, and mind, we cannot appreciate that life, even at the end of life, even if it might be suffering, is still good. And that any kind of expedition of death is something contrary to God's law. These two commands are integral. They must always be kept together. But if we confuse the order, then the second, loving our neighbor, will never be fully expressed in the way that God is asking of us. So here's the challenge. Who or what do you love over and above God? We all put things before God. Maybe not all the time, but on occasion. Maybe when I'm on vacation, I put vacation and family time over and above God by not going to Mass when I'm on vacation. Maybe I put my spouse over and above God. Maybe I put my children over and above God. Who or what do you put before God that God is trying to invite you to put in its proper order so that you can love your neighbor as he has commanded? So that's the challenge this week, to identify those things or those people who I put over and above God, even if only on occasion. He answered rightly. Which of these three, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robbers, the one who treated him with mercy? Go and do likewise. The scholar thought he knew it all. He wanted to restrict and define who neighbor is. Jesus tends to kind of transform and surprise us in ways that we're not expecting. And I want to propose to you that the surprise that you might find in putting God first is that he will provide an avenue to help your neighbor in the way they need to be helped. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.